Mr. Pretorius. Your mic, Mr. Pretorius. Your mic.
My apologies, Chair. We're at paragraph 46 of your statement, Minister Nene, and you had described to the Chair that you had been invited to tour the Guptas Sahara computer offices in Midrand on 2 occasions in 2010. What did you know of the Guptas at that stage?
Not much, as I said, except that, having met them at a presidential event and, sitting at the high table, that they were close to the president. But other than that, very little, until they introduced themselves and introduced me to their business as well.
Right. Is it normal for a deputy minister to visit businesses at the request of individual citizens or non-citizens, such as the Guptas?
Indeed, I saw nothing wrong with it. I still see nothing wrong also in engaging with people who are in any form of business.
Yes. During these visits, let me take a step back, Minister. We've heard evidence from more than one witness in regard to the conduct of the Guptas. The observation may be made that they weren't exactly shy or reluctant to place demands, to express interests, and to, in a nutshell, try to obtain favors in their interests where they desired to do so. Did anything of that sort occur on your visits to Sahara Computers?
Not really, and as I said earlier, mine was a completely different one because I'm not too sure what the plan was, but they marketed, it was almost like a PR exercise. The 2 things that stood out for me was that they would actually continuously repeat the issue that they don't do business with government. 2, showing themselves what their contribution is to the economy in terms of when we visited the Sahara, youth employment, they are in the computer space, they are good corporate citizens. And I think that was the key message that they would be driving home most of the time. But
in retrospect, how would you describe their conduct then in those meetings, which seems to be, at least to a degree, out of sync with other evidence that we've heard?
Indeed. The only time I got suspicious was then it was proven when around 2013, it turned out that there was an investigation that the Treasury was doing on one of their, on the dairy in the Free State, where they were directly involved. That's when I actually, got suspicious of this ongoing narrative of them not doing business with the state, because that seemed to contradict what they had said.
Who in particular? I'm sorry,
Mr. Pretorius. I'm sorry. Before you proceed, you have emphasized quite a few times that on those occasions, or at least some of them when you met with them, they liked emphasizing that they did not do business with the state. What was your understanding of the context or the need for them to make that statement so repeatedly?
It was in response to what they were saying. People say they are benefiting from the state because of their relationship with the president, and they actually wanted to clarify that they actually don't do business with the state.
Already at that time, there were those allegations that they were benefiting from.
It was coming from them, yes, that people accused them of that, but I didn't know of such. It was for that reason that it was a bit strange that they are responding to a question that I have not asked.
And you say, from your recollection, in terms of what you knew then or what was known publicly, you can't remember whether publicly there were those allegations about them?
Not
already?
that I knew of.
Yes, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Right. Perhaps with hindsight, Minister, we know that at that time you were a person of influence, and we know with hindsight, or certainly there has been evidence and will be more evidence, that the Gupta brothers took steps to influence or exploit relationships with persons of influence within government. You deal later with a briefing in relation to the launch of New Age, but for the present, it may be surprising in the context, and again I emphasize with hindsight of all the evidence that we've heard to date and what has been in the public domain, that they gave you no hint at all. And if they did give you a hint, would you tell the Chair, of anything untoward in their relationship with, in particular, you during those visits to Sahara Computers in Midrand?
Indeed, there was no hint then, but it's only when one looks back that you realize that, perhaps the PR exercise might have been an exercise of trying to conceal something.
Who in particular invited you to visit at Sahara Computers?
Mr. Ajay Gupta.
And were there any other persons present during those visits?
There might have been staff at the Sahara Computers whose identity I wouldn't know.
Right. And the other Gupta brothers?
No, at that meeting.
And then who invited you to, as you put it, tea at his house?
It was Ajay Gupta.
And to discuss the economy, can you go into a little more detail? What was the purpose of that visit, or that invitation, insofar as you could?
Well, they seemed casual, but at the same time, when somebody says, "Can you pop in for tea?" and I must also say that at that time I had no reason also to think that might have an adverse impact, because, like I said, when one of the requests was also for me to contribute to a magazine that was published by former Minister Mr. Isopahad, which was called The Thinker, and I actually most of the time I would leave the home with my own magazine because that was being promoted. But also then when one was briefed on the impending launch of the New Age, so the discussion was about the contribution they're making also in that space. And also that the media in South Africa was hostile to government and the ANC. So it is important that there is a much more objective view, which is what they were purporting to be putting across. And as such also, requesting us that when they launch these media houses, that we as government should support. And the briefing to me was portrayed as a briefing that is also given to my other colleagues.
During what period did you visit their home in Saxonwold on the 4 occasions you mentioned in paragraph 47?
It was, I think it was during around 2010 as Deputy Minister. And perhaps again in Midrand, I think in 2013. But just between that time, around 2010 and 2013. It is not very easy to attach actual dates to those visits because it was normally not planned visits. You get a call when you get invited, and if you do have time, you pop in. If you don't have the time again, there are a number of those where I would actually say, I'm not available. But when available, I would then pop in.
I understand. At that time, or during that period, besides being Deputy Minister, what official positions did you hold?
Besides being Deputy Minister, it is a position that is, by virtue of being Deputy Minister, that you are appointed as a non-executive director of the Public Investment Corporation and chairperson of the PIC.
And what is the role of the Public Investment Corporation?
The Public Investment Corporation is a fund manager for the Government Employees Pension Fund. Right. And other government funds like the Compensation Commission and the UIF.
And does it give loans to businesses and institutions?
It does give loans to businesses and institutions, but it also co-finances or buys equity into some businesses with other partners.
Again, in relation to the interests of the Guptas and their related companies and their communications with persons in influence, are you aware of any loans that the Public Investment Corporation made to the Guptas or Gupta-related entities?
No, not that I'm aware of, except the inquiry that I refer to in paragraph 50, where the Mr. Ajay Gupta, when I was Minister of Finance, where he wanted he raised an issue that he was having with Mr. Iqbal Swev of Independent Media, where he wanted to know from me whether it could be correct that the agreement that Mr. Swev has with the PIC precluded him from entering into a partnership with the Guptas to form an independent media group.
Yes, we'll come to that in a moment. Yeah. But at a more general level, given the evidence so far, to the extent that that evidence is correct, that the Guptas were not shy in pursuing their interests in relation to persons of influence, and given your positions as Deputy Minister and Chair of the PIC, the question may, it seems, be asked, is it not strange that they wouldn't have approached you directly, as was their wont during that time, to attempt to ask you to exercise your influence in their favor?
I would have found it strange if they did, after having been so clear that they do not do business with the state.
Right, you talk about later visits being related to the impending launch of New Age. Could you just expand on that a bit, please?
It was just a briefing that they are in the process of launching a newspaper, and as they did also with the launch of the TV station, that it is going to be presenting an alternative perspective to the public rather than what we have currently in South Africa, where most of the media houses are actually hostile to the state and to the governing party.
During these visits, was there any request for or assumption that there would be support for the New Age venture?
Well, it was clear that the intention is that because we make use of the other media houses, they are introducing an alternative, and it would make sense that we support the media houses.
Did they ask for support directly?
Not directly, but they introduced themselves as going to be the alternative voice.
Was that request for support an assumption, underlying assumption in their approach?
Indeed, yeah.
In paragraph 48, you refer again to the visits to the Saxonwold home, and you refer to Mr. Jacob Zuma being present. Do you see that in paragraph 48?
Correct.
What did you think about his presence at the house in Saxonwold?
It just confirmed the relationship that the family had with the president's family.
What did you know at that time of that relationship?
Well, I just knew that they were very close to the president. As I said earlier, even when I saw them for the first time, it was because they were sitting with the president on the main table.
Within the Treasury, I presume that you are assisted by advisors who would keep an eye on matters relevant to Treasury functions as to what is reported in the media and in other sources of information. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
Did you have any warning before 2013 from what existed in the public domain concerning the Guptas and their role in South Africa?
Not necessarily, but I mean, 2013 on the dairy farm was actually for me, the first flashing light.
What did you learn about the family's intentions at that time?
There was an investigation that the Treasury was embarking on, which showed that their relationship with that community and the project itself was not done in accordance with the regulations.
Did you take any steps in Treasury to deal with that issue?
Yes, there was an investigation, an ongoing investigation, which was concluded and given to the law enforcement authorities once concluded.
Yes, is that the ENS investigation?
Correct.
Edward Nathan Sonnenberg's investigation?
Correct. Yeah.
And there, we know subsequent to that there were further investigations?
Correct.
Were you satisfied with the contents of the ENS investigation?
Look, we thought, because it actually meant that there should be further investigations, that it had run its course and it had completed what it was supposed to do. But that was purely a matter also that was dealt with more at an official's level than at the ministerial level.
In 2014, you say in paragraph 50 that you went to their house on 2 occasions in the latter half of 2014.
Yes.
By this time, presumably you had formed an attitude in regard to the family and its intentions.
Correct.
So much so that there were official investigations at the instance of Treasury in regard to their conduct.
Indeed.
Why did you accept the invitation at this stage?
Look, I thought I should not be influenced by just the investigation, which had not been concluded, but at the same time, managing a relationship means you are now going to be more careful and circumspect in dealing with people, but it does not necessarily mean that all of a sudden you say, I can't talk to you because I'm told you are being investigated.
Who invited you?
It was Ajay again.
And presumably you felt reasonably assured and comfortable that you should go to the Gupta household rather than to summon them if they wanted to speak to your officers.
Well, the invitation had come in the manner that the previous invitations had come, and I thought it would do no harm to honor the invitation and hear him out, which I did. And he then indicated that he had this problem. And yeah, on my return also I was able to come back to him and say, we have nothing to do with the agreements you have with Mr. Iqbal.
All right, so since your first visit to Sahara Computers in Midrand, it is now 2014, the approach to you regarding the relationship between the Guptas and Mr. Iqbal Survey of independent mediator, was this the first time that any request to intervene had been made to you?
It was, yes.
Again, the question may be asked that given evidence, it would be unusual that it would take 4 years for this tentative request to be made to you, given your relationship with the Guptas, your frequent visits to their premises. Do you have any comment in regard to that?
I wouldn't...
Just again,
Yes.
if I may put it bluntly, it's out of sync with the evidence we know.
Look, I wouldn't know what the history was, because what they were saying is that they had an agreement with him, that they would go together. And he was, and at that time, Mr. Ajay Gupta told me that they are having a court case with him where he is now refusing to honor his commitment to them. And he says the reason why he cannot is because in the agreement between himself and the PIC, he cannot accommodate them.
Right. We know now that at this time you are, in fact, Minister of Finance.
Correct.
And Mr. Ajay Gupta, you say, raised an issue with you concerning his relationship with Mr. Iqbal Survey of independent media. Is it correct that Mr. Survey had obtained a loan from the PIC, Public Investment Corporation?
I understand so, yes.
A substantial loan?
We're including the co-investment, yes, with the PIC.
Yes, in the region of R1 billion, according to
I can't remember the actual numbers, but it is a substantial.
And did Mr. Gupta want a part of that finance?
Well, it meant that they had an agreement. He says they had an agreement that they would be part of that one. But Mr. Iqbal Survey was reneging on that agreement. So the inquiry was, because he says it can't be done because of the PIC agreement, ours was, is that correct? And I said, in terms of the agreement between the PIC and whoever else is in funding with, that wouldn't be the PIC's matter to interfere in the agreements.
And that is the clarification that you say you gave him?
Correct. And beyond that, my humble request also was that if he has further queries, he must raise them directly with the PIC.
Right. And we have learnt in the short time in which we've been able to examine the issues in your statement that there was a prospect, at least, of litigation between Gupta, perhaps Oak Bay Investments on the one hand, and independent media, Mr. Survey on the other. Do you know of that litigation?
He alluded, Mr. Ajay Gupta alluded to that. He said there was a court. He said there was a court case.
Over the period of at least 4 years, from 2010 to 2014, apart from the request in relation to Mr. Survey and independent media on the one hand, and the Guptas and we presume Oak Bay Investments on the other, was any other request made to you during that period?
No, not that I can remember.
Was any offer or any form of inducement made to you?
None whatsoever.
Let's move on to a slightly different topic, please, Minister. On the 12th of June 2018, you had occasion to address a letter to Mr. Floyd Shivambu, Minister of Parliament and a member of the Economic Freedom Fighters. You deal with that in paragraph 52.
Indeed.
May I refer you to the bundle at page 318. Do you recognize this document?
What page did you say, Mr. Gutierrez?
318, annexure NN3.
318.
318. Probably in your second bundle. Bundle K1B.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I do recognize the document.
On page 321, it appears that this letter is dated 12 June 2018. Is that your signature there?
That is correct.
What was the context that required this letter to be written by yourself?
It was in response to a letter that I had received from Mr. Shibam.
And what was the date of that letter?
It was sometime in May.
Does that appear on page 318?
Yes, it was dated the 22nd of May.
And would you briefly relate to the Chair what you stated to Mr. Shivambu in response to his letter of 22 May 2018?
In his letter, he had insinuated that I facilitated the Guptas' access to the PIC during my tenure as Deputy Minister of Finance. I confirmed that I had met some members of the Gupta family during government functions, especially the dinner hosted by the President and the presentation of the State Nation, after the presentation of the State of the Nation address, and that on one of these occasions I was invited to tour the mid-rand offices because that was the content of his question as well, and that in both my role as Minister of Finance and my positions as Deputy Minister of Finance, I've been approached by numerous individuals and companies asking for my assistance in securing finance, especially from the PIC. In all instances, these individuals, with no exceptions, and companies were informed that they should approach the PIC directly through its formal channels.
And is that the letter that we've just referred to at page 318?
And that's the letter that we are referring to, because there were quite a number of questions and sub-questions as well.
Right. Before you go on, at the outset of your evidence, we referred to a certain public statement issued on behalf of the Economic Freedom Front in relation to your evidence today, or the prospect of your evidence today. I'm not going to place that document on record until both the Commission and your own legal representatives have had a chance to interrogate that document and to deal with the rather general allegations contained therein, and to emphasize once more that we have no direct evidence from the EFF in regard to the contents. Safe to say that in paragraph 2 of that document, it states that the EFF wrote a letter to Nhlanhla Nene on 22 May 2018 asking him about his relationship with the Guptas and the many instances he negotiated business dealings with them. And there's a further statement following that saying that you refused to respond to those questions. Is that statement correct?
That statement is incorrect, because as, the letter included, which was written on the 12th of June, was a response to the letter that they wrote on the 22nd. So the letter was responded to. I can confirm that. We followed it up when also we saw in the public space that they were saying that I had not responded. We actually followed up with our parliamentary.
We'll come to the further evidence in a moment. Save to highlight at this stage that certainly, notwithstanding the absence of any evidence given to us, the Commission will look at the allegations, investigate them, and you've expressed your willingness to respond.
Absolutely.
At the appropriate time.
That's correct.
On 14 September 2018, did you receive another set of questions from Mr. Shivambu?
Indeed, I did, which is now in the form of the parliamentary question, insinuating again that I had meetings with the Gupta family when I was Deputy Minister of Finance to discuss business dealings, and in particular in relation to PIC funding of the Gupta family. He further insinuates that I was contacted by the Gupta family when I was Minister of Finance to secure promises that I had made to them whilst I was Deputy Minister of Finance. I am yet to respond to the subsequent questions raised by Mr. Shivambu. However, I wish to confirm that other than what I've indicated above, I've never had any meetings with them to discuss their business funding from the PIC when I was Deputy Minister of Finance or when I was Minister of Finance, other than what I've stated above.
We've dealt briefly with your official position as Chair of PIC. Again, during what period did you occupy the position of Chair of the Public Investment Corporation?
Well, I'd like to point out that I became Chair of the PIC between 2009 to 2014 in my capacity as Deputy Minister. And as it was practice, that Deputy Minister is appointed by Cabinet as a non-executive director and Chair of the Board of the PIC. And as is the practice with this role, I was not involved in decision-making except where a specific transaction would have had to be approved by the board.
And that would be as per the delegation of authority transactions over a certain value?
True.
Do you ever recall approving a transaction in favor of the Guptas or a Gupta-related entity?
No. But I must also just state that all investments approved by the PIC, as stated in paragraph 55, are made in terms of investment mandate and must fit the mandate. And approvals are also done in terms of the board-approved delegations of authority. And if the transaction had served on the board, I would have not been the one making a decision, if it did, but the collective board.
And in relation to any allegation that might be made that you acted inappropriately with regard to any investments made by the PIC, what is your response?
Again, I deny that I've ever acted inappropriately with regard to any investments made by the PIC. I deny any and every allegation also that I knowingly acted to promote any funding from the PIC for any business involving my son, as the EFF has also alleged in the social media.
What was that allegation?
The allegation was that my son's oil company benefited from the PIC whilst I was chair of the...
And what do you say about that particular allegation?
I indeed do deny any and every allegation that I acted to promote any funding from the PIC for any business involving my son. And it is a matter that we are also pursuing with the PIC to obtain any evidence if there is any thing of that nature.
And that may be the subject of further investigations.
Yes.
And then,
but we are convinced that again, this one is also baseless. But as you correctly pointed out, that these developments will have to be dealt with at the right time.
You also refer to what you describe as fake WhatsApp messages. What was the import of those?
Absolutely. It is in the same WhatsApp message where the EFF also alleges that my wife received foreign funds into her offshore account. Again, I reject with the contempt it deserves that fake WhatsApp messages alleging my wife has received any foreign funds in any account belonging to her. She does not have any foreign account and did not receive any funds from any foreign sources.
Right. You've given general evidence in relation to Treasury, its integrity, attacks on its integrity and personnel. In relation to these particular incidents, were they, in your view, simply random attacks on yourself and your integrity, or do you place any more import on them than that?
Well, whenever I was confronted with making any final decision on any request made to me by anybody, my practice is always to ensure that the department first provides me with advice and also that I approve requests that are within my legal and statutory powers.
Yes, we understand that. My question, and perhaps it wasn't clear, do you have any comment to make about the origins of these accusations, why they should be made?
I have absolutely no idea where they are coming from. I'm only just I find it interesting. What I find interesting is the timing of these allegations and the manner in which they are raised in the social media and not through the appropriate channels when we know that they are such.
And in relation to the timing, what is significant?
Well, the timing was, it was just a few days before my appearance before the commission. And I found it very interesting and strange that immediately, just a few days before my appearance, then they are beginning to surface.
Yes, when the document from the Economic Freedom Front comes before the Commission in due course, certain motives do appear apparent, but let's deal with that in due course.
In due course, yeah.
Can we move on then to the nuclear procurement issue, and in particular the summit that took place in Russia? And just by way of introduction, I understand that although you have your own views of what happened to you at the hands of the President and your position as Minister, you wish to describe to the Chair the circumstances which prevailed at the time, and whatever inferences can be drawn from that may be done at a later stage.
Correct. Well, Chair, it is well known that the potential nuclear build program has been contentious and controversial and has been the subject of media reports. Preparations for the implementation of the nuclear build program began in 2011 with the Cabinet approval and subsequent promulgation of the Integrated Resource Plan, the IRP 2010, which provided for nuclear power to contribute an additional 9.6 gigawatts to the energy mix by 2030, with the first new plant coming online in 2023.
What is the origins of the Integrated Resource Plan? What are the origins of such a plan? Under whose auspices is that plan developed?
That plan is intended to map out how government is going to implement its energy resourcing of the country.
And who is responsible for the preparation of that plan?
It is the Department of Energy.
Then you describe the establishment of a particular committee in November 2011. What is that committee?
That committee that was established in 2011 is the National Nuclear Energy Executive Coordinating Committee, which was a political structure that would oversee the nuclear program.
Was that a standing committee or was it a special purpose committee?
It was a special purpose committee. At its inception, it was chaired by the then Deputy President, Mr. Nhlanhla, and later on by former President Zuma, who took over the chairing of this committee. In 2014, it was transformed into the Energy Security Cabinet Subcommittee, which was led by the President and included the then Minister of Energy, Mr. Ben Martens, and other relevant ministers.
Were there subcommittees that were relevant to this exercise?
The Energy Security Cabinet Subcommittee was supported by a technical committee, the Nuclear Energy Technical Committee, which was headed by the Department of Energy. But underneath it were various technical committees from different departments. For instance, the Corporate Finance and Procurement Sub-Work Group, where the Treasury officials participated, had Treasury and Department of Public Enterprises as co-chairs.
What was the relationship between the Department of Energy and Treasury in relation to the nuclear program? And I ask this question particularly because of what transpired later at a cabinet meeting on the 9th of December 2015.
The two departments were supposed to consult each other, especially with regards to National Treasury's responsibility on the affordability and the feasibility of the implementation of the...
We'll say a little more about that in due course, but did the Department of Energy provide Treasury with a feasibility study?
Indeed, in December 2013, the Department of Energy provided Treasury with a draft feasibility study for the nuclear program.
Treasury's response?
And upon review of the Treasury's analysis of the draft feasibility study, it became apparent to me that regardless of the underlying policy rationale to develop nuclear energy capacity, the costs associated with it were astronomical. The envisaged 9.6 gigawatt nuclear new build program would have constituted the largest public investment program in South Africa's history, and relative to the size of the South African economy, would have been one of the largest public sector investments ever undertaken internationally.
By that you mean undertaken by any other country?
Absolutely. The total investment required would have had material consequences for ESCOM's and the country's foreign and domestic debt, fiscal and financial position, the balance of payment and sovereign balance sheet for decades to come, as well as investment grading, which would have had implications for all South Africans.
Before you go on, Minister Nene, obviously it would be unfair to ask you to give precise figures or amounts, but could you give the Chair an idea of the size of the financial investment that would be required in relation to the budget?
Look, in the absence of a study, because as we spoke earlier here about a feasibility study for which was a draft, and the costings taking into account a number of factors and a number of scenarios that the National Treasury had started running, but there wasn't a proper funding model also on the table. So we hadn't arrived at a figure, but it's for that reason that we looked at it with the different scenarios. I remember, I just don't have the figures with me, but I remember one of them actually where we had said, if we were to break it down into sizable chunks where at least 2.4 gigawatts were to be, in the initial phase, it would come to it with taking into account the exchange rate at that time. It would have perhaps come to something like half a trillion, a quarter of a trillion, 250 billion rands.
Right. That's just for a phased approach.
For a phased approach, that was just about.
Would that mean, and I don't want to be superficial here, but that if one tried to cost, in the most general terms, the project as a whole, it might exceed 1 trillion.
It could have, given the exchange rate at that time, but going forward. But it was one of those that you couldn't conclusively say that was the figure, because it needed more work to be done in order to be able to arrive at a real number.
But given the size of the cost of the exercise, you say that, well, it is clear that it couldn't be paid for in cash, but what would the consequences or implications be for future generations?
Well, our concern was that the recovery of the nuclear build cost through the tariff would have profound consequences for the economy and the South African users of electricity. This point had become much clearer for me in the face of mounting resistance to the electronic tolling in Gauteng, where the user pay principle was being turned on its head. Construction costs that had originally been meant to be recovered through tariffs were being paid for from general tax revenue, with deleterious consequences for public policy and fiscal management.
Yes, and you refer to consequences being there for decades.
Correct. There would have been large risks associated with the nuclear build program. Global experience also, if I were to venture into that one, has shown that the large upfront capital investment, long construction period, and the complexity of nuclear projects means that nuclear power projects are especially sensitive to construction risks arising from delays and disruptions, cost overruns, and increases in financing costs. If these risks materialize, the increased costs are locked into the cost of electricity for the lifetime of the project. Therefore, the proposed nuclear program was not only scrutinized by the stakeholders involved, but it was questioned by by the public whose funds were going to be used to finance it.
These implications, did they place any burden on Treasury?
Indeed, which meant that Treasury needed to carefully study the feasibility and fiscal affordability of the proposed nuclear project. The funding model was central to the determination of affordability. In other words, key issues were the fiscal affordability of the funding or guarantees to secure borrowing that would be required to finance the project, and the impact on the economy of the electricity tariff required to repay the debt used to finance the project. In the light of legal obligations of my position, I would ultimately have to approve on behalf of government the funding model based on its viability.
Just to pause there, we may assume without leading that the implementation of a project of this size would require substantial borrowings. You've mentioned that that would have implications for the fiscus for decades. What would the funding of the project have meant for other government functions and responsibilities?
Well, it would have implications without a doubt. Because when you have a major project of this nature, the impact actually does filter to other departments as well, in terms of either crowding out some of the expenditure that otherwise would have gone to other government expenditure.
And as you've testified to, the experience of relying on self-funding models has not turned out to be a reliable method of funding.
Absolutely. I make an example of the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project with e-tolls, where there was a revolt and the public not being keen to pay for the roads that had already been constructed with major risks to the fiscus.
Right. And your evidence thus far, as I understand it, is that insofar as the project or proposal was in the hands of the Ministry of Energy, the financial funding model had not been adequately or properly investigated.
Indeed.
Yes. What happened then on the 22nd of September 2014?
Well, on the 22nd of September 2014, we were informed that the new Minister of Energy, because remember the former minister was Minister Ben Martens, Minister of Energy was now Ms. Jumat Peterson, who announced that Russia and South Africa had signed an intergovernmental framework agreement. This agreement laid the foundation for a nuclear build program or procurement.
And then in June 2015?
The Minister tabled in Parliament, the Minister of Energy tabled in Parliament 5 intergovernmental nuclear cooperation agreements that had been concluded with a number of countries: the Russian Federation, France and the People's Republic of China, and the United States of America and South Korea for approval.
Right.
These are attached as and annexed as NN4. Just to make sure the page number. The page is 322, is 322 through to, I think, 420.
We know, and I presume you're aware of litigation in respect of these agreements in the Cape Provincial Division.
Yes, I do.
And the result was, I understand, that at least to an extent the agreements were set aside.
Absolutely.
Yes. We needn't go into that for the moment. But you refer in paragraph 69 to a cabinet decision. What was that decision?
Cabinet took a decision that amongst, others required the Minister of Energy, in consultation with the Minister of Finance and the coordinating committee I spoke about of the National Nuclear Energy Coordinating Committee, as a matter of urgency to present a memorandum to Cabinet dealing with the financial implications, proposed funding model, risk mitigation strategies for the nuclear new build program, and the contributions by countries as contained in the intergovernmental agreements.
We now get to the BRICS summit, which took place in Russia during July 2015. Would you describe your participation in the summit as you do in paragraph 70?
Well, shortly after this incident where we were supposed to do this with the Department of Energy, the annual diplomatic summit of heads of state or governments of the BRICS member states summit was scheduled to take place from the 8th to the 9th of July 2015 in Ufa, Russia. I was a member of the South African government delegation that attended these meetings.
UFA is spelled UFA.
UFA, yes. Ufa, yes. I, however, first had to start in Moscow, Russia, on the 7th of July, where I attended the BRICS finance ministers and central bank governors meeting, and the first meeting of the board of governors of the new development bank, which is known as the BRICS Bank. Accompanying me in Russia were the Director General of the National Treasury, Mr. Lungisa Fuzile, who returned home after attending all the meetings that took place in Moscow, where the founding documents of the BRICS Bank were ratified and the bank was formally established. I continued to Ufa with the Deputy Director General, Ms. Mahoshi Petlaliheta, who proceeded with the delegation to Ufa, and Mr. Marlon Geswent, who is the Chief of Staff in my office. In Ufa, I, together with other ministers, attended a briefing meeting with former President Zuma on the 8th of July 2015. The intention was to brief Mr. Zuma on the summit and his forthcoming one-on-one meeting with President Putin of Russia.
What was the practice in relation to your role at such a summit and the need to brief the President?
Well, the President had to be briefed on a number of things, including agreements. For instance, in this instance, we had just concluded the establishment of the bank. All of that information needed to be given to the President so that the President is aware of those things, because this Heads of State summit is mainly for heads of state. Our contribution is a supportive role.
Matters of some importance, I presume.
Absolutely.
Rather than deal with these matters, the former President chose to deal with the issue of nuclear procurement.
Indeed, President Zuma proceeded to discuss the issue of nuclear procurement in South Africa. In a sense, he wanted to know what progress the Minister of Energy, as I said, that we were tasked by Cabinet to consult and finalize the matter, as to what progress the Minister of Energy and I had made on the nuclear deal, as Cabinet had directed us to prepare a memorandum on, among others, the financial implications and funding model of the nuclear program. Excuse me.
How did you respond?
I indicated to the President that the absence of details regarding the proposed financing of the project made it difficult to make progress with the memorandum. I was also surprised that the Treasury officials were not allowed in the meeting, even though the Director General of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation
What was the tone of the meeting?
Tone of the meeting was indeed, I felt very tense and hostile towards me. The President criticized me for not finalizing the financial aspects of the proposed nuclear deal with Russia. And he also said he was not happy that I was not doing what I was supposed to have done a long time ago, so that he could have something to present when he meets with his counterpart, President Putin, for their one-on-one meeting.
What is your understanding, or what was your understanding at that stage of of the former President's expectations in regard to what he would be discussing in regarding to this deal with President Putin?
The expectation was that we must have reached some form of, we must have made enough progress so that in his conversation with his counterpart, he is able to present a case.
Right. And you then refer in the next paragraph to the Minister of Energy, Ms. Jumat Peterson.
Yes, the former Minister of Energy, Ms. Jumat Peterson, for her part, draft letter, a mere
country would have been vast. You've given that evidence. The
Minister, please articulate your answer so the record can, it can be contained in the record.
The record doesn't pick up a nod.
Oh, pardon. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I agree with you. I'm sorry. Yes.
Apart from that, the cabinet had mandated that there be a.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Brito. I think the question you had asked earlier, where he nodded,
yes,
his answer hasn't been captured.
Okay.
Do you want to repeat that?
Well,
it was about the enormity of the cost, I think it was.
Yes, you have given evidence about the financial implications of the implementation of a nuclear procurement program for the country and the vast implications it would have for the country financially for, as you described it, decades to come. That was the context in which this meeting was taking place, am I correct?
Correct, yes.
Cabinet had also instructed that there be a financial feasibility study so that the details of these financial implications could be known.
That's correct, yes.
Had this work been done by the time you and Ms. Juma Peterson were present in this meeting with the former president?
It had not been completed. It is for that reason that I say, because there was information that needed to be given to us, the funding model from the Department of Energy, it had not been provided to us as the National Treasury in order to commence the work. The scenarios I spoke about earlier were just the preliminary feasibility that the National Treasury had conducted.
How did you understand the letter in relation to financial commitments that it might place on the South African fiscus?
It is for that reason also that I understood the letter to be committing the South African government to future commitments to Russia if Russia were to build on behalf of South Africa.
Given your duties, was it possible for you to respond positively to the request to sign that letter?
No, it would not have been prudent for me to do so.
Well, would it have been legal for you to do so?
Without following due process, no.
Did the Minister of Energy, as far as you know, appreciate that it was necessary for the feasibility study that you say, I think, had not been completed to be completed before such a commitment could be made?
I think she did appreciate, but I think she also felt under pressure to conclude, to have the matter concluded. And I felt that the letter was not the correct approach also of dealing with matters of this nature.
And you have said that if you had signed that letter, that would have committed the government of South Africa to, that would have resulted in a commitment with vast, huge financial implications for the country. You say she also would have appreciated that.
I expected her to appreciate that.
Now, the pressure that you say you think she was under also came from whom or from where?
The pressure came from, I think for both of us, came from the former president, Mr. Zuma.
Thank you.
What was your response to Minister Juma Peterson when requested to sign this letter?
My response was that I would not append my signature, but if she wants to sign the letter, she must go ahead, but purely, alone, and I cautioned that whatever she ultimately signs should not have any financial commitments.
Let me just follow up on the questions I asked earlier. As at that time, were you satisfied that the president himself appreciated the financial implications for the country if that commitment was made?
I don't think the president appreciated the actual financial implications because nothing had been presented But I felt that maybe the issues of financial implications were secondary to him rather than an agreement.
But would you know whether he appreciated the legal requirements, which I think you have talked about in terms of process that needed to be complied with before such commitments could be made, or is that something you are not sure about?
I cannot be sure about it. I can't be sure about it.
Thank you.
Right. According to your statement, Ms. Peterson responded to you and to your refusal to sign the relevant document. What was her comment about the involvement of the Ministry of Finance?
Well, she insisted that it had to be a joint decision of both the Ministers of Energy and Finance. She was not satisfied with my response, but agreed to revise the letter, because I said she must revise the letter so that it is purely a letter from the Department of Energy, which only deals, as the other agreements might have been signed, which had nothing to do with the financial implications.
And would not have financial commitments, as you say.
Yes.
What happened after that meeting?
Well, I took a break with the officials that I was traveling with and briefed them on the meeting and my refusal to sign the letter presented to me by the Minister of Energy. And after that, if I may proceed.
Yes, please.
And after that, about an hour later, the Minister of Energy brought a revised letter to me. And after reading it, I recall concluding that the fiscal and financial implications still remained. I rejected the letter again.
What was her response?
Pardon?
What was her response to your rejection of the letter?
Well, she was concerned about what she is now going to present to the President. And I then, because given my refusal to sign, I told her that I don't know what she should say, but I wouldn't sign without seeing and approving the funding model as duly required by Cabinet and without the necessary process being followed for such a big project. She left, and I was not presented with any further version of the letter.
Given your interactions with Minister Nhlanhla Peterson at that stage, what was your impression of any anxiety that she may have had or any pressure that she might have felt in relation to having to report back your refusal to the former president?
I could see she really wanted to give a positive response to the president. But it was unfortunate that if that response would be carrying financial implications, I was not in a position to assist her.
Right. What were the consequences then of your refusal to sign that letter and the revised letter?
Well, as a result of my refusal to sign the letter, it was clear that I was seen as a person standing in the way of this nuclear deal. I was accused of insubordination, not only by the President, but by some of my colleagues.
Were those words directly used?
Pardon?
The word insubordination, is that a direct quote?
Not directly, but that it was inferred.
Words to that effect?
Yes.
Yes.
And I recall that the attitude of some of my colleagues also, particularly the Minister of International Relations, Minister Maite Nkwani Mashabane, and the Minister of State Security, Minister David Mahlobo, the attitude was very hostile, and they actually wanted me to sign and felt that it was not right that the issues on the nuclear deal had not been finalized.
What was your response to them in turn? Or what was your attitude to their attitude?
Look, I stood my ground because I knew it was correct for me not to append my signature if the due processes had not been followed.
Sorry, Minister, if you go back to paragraph 76 with regard to the reference to insubordination, so would it be more accurate to read that sentence, which is the second sentence of paragraph 76, to read it to say, I was accused of, in effect, insubordination? because as I understand it, they didn't use the word insubordination, but that's what you inferred.
Correct. I would accept that.
Okay,
Chair.
thank you.
You were dealing with the statement at paragraph 77, Minister Nene, in relation to your own attitude to the response of your colleagues, or at least certain of your colleagues.
Yes, I think my colleagues, with respect, failed to understand the implications of my signature on the document. That is, concurrence in my capacity as Minister of Finance to commitments which would have been binding on the South African government. And as the Minister of Finance, I was responsible for ensuring the secure, accountable, transparent, sound, effective and efficient management of the country's public finances, sovereign debt, and the economy at large. Section 66 of the Public Finance Management Act provides that only the Minister of Finance, as I said earlier, may enter into a transaction that binds or may bind the National Revenue Fund, that is the fiscus, to any future financial commitment.
Just to pause a moment there, there are two ways of perceiving these facts. The one is in relation to what was known to you at the time. Given your knowledge at the time, what is your view of the responsibility, legality, wisdom of committing the South African government to the nuclear project at that time?
Look, we had publicly said that as it forms part of the energy mix, and if we proceed with it, it must be done at a pace and cost that would be affordable to the country. That was our clear line.
And was that the position at the time? Were you in a position to make such a decision at the time?
Not without the information that would assist us to make up.
And with hindsight, with what knowledge one has now of the size and implications of such a deal, what would your comment be about the wisdom of having committed the government to such a project at that stage?
I still believe it wouldn't have been a wise idea. It wouldn't have been prudent.
May I just go back and take you back again to that paragraph 76? It is something quite important in the context of the fact that you were subsequently removed from the position of minister, that you were accused in effect of insubordination, and you say not only by the president but by some of your colleagues as well. Now, do you recall what the president may have said, what words or tone he may have used that made you take the view that he was in effect accusing you of insubordination?
He was obviously very upset, and he felt it was unacceptable that cabinet had given instructions. This has not been carried out, and I have not done what I was supposed to do, even though I had given my reason for being unable to do that because of the unavailability of the relevant information that would assist me and the department in making that decision.
And was he at the cabinet meeting which said that the feasibility study must be done first, as I understand your evidence, or you must tell me if I misunderstand it? My understanding is that cabinet had said a feasibility study must be done first. Was he part of that meeting?
I believe so, but I can't be sure. The president at times would miss some of the cabinet meetings and would be chaired by. So at that particular meeting, I cannot be certain, but I think it can be verified.
Yes. But if he was part, it would be he would have been, if he was part of that meeting and was aware, or was not part but was aware of what Cabinet had decided, but nevertheless wanted you to do something that was contrary to a Cabinet decision, namely, let's have a feasibility study first, then it would have been quite strange, or not, that he would want that something be done contrary to what Cabinet has said, or would it not really be? Or what would you...
I think there was this a lack of appreciation of the time between that Cabinet decision and the meeting we were having to expect that must have been concluded by the time we were in Russia. But also the absence of the relevant information to the Treasury, because if the matter had to be concluded with the agency that the Cabinet had signaled, that information was supposed to be made available to the National Treasury in order for National Treasury to be able, but it had not been done.
I mean, for me, part of the relevance of whether he had that knowledge or not is that it seems that with regard to some of the allegations of state capture, there seems to be allegations that procedures were sought to be deliberately breached or not followed in order to achieve certain objectives, and I'm trying to see whether this may have anything of that. But you say you can't be sure whether the President himself was or was not at the meeting which made that decision.
Yes, my reading was that there was just lack of appreciation of
yes.
Whether that could have been concluded between that Cabinet meeting and the meeting that we were having.
Yes. Now, you also say that it was not just him, but also some of your colleagues, in effect, accused you of insubordination. Would you remember whether these would be, or some of them at least, would be colleagues who had been party to this Cabinet decision, but nevertheless who saw you as being insubordinate for insisting on compliance with what Cabinet had said before a decision could be made?
Those ministers must have probably been part of that decision themselves. Yes. But again, like I was saying, yeah. I'm saying, Deputy Chief Justice, was that what I found strange was the lack of appreciation of the work that needed to be done, and the fact that it was almost like it is only the Minister of Finance who has not discharged his responsibility, and yet the relevant information that was supposed to come from the Department of Energy had not come forth. But the Department of Energy was not under the same attack and pressure to provide such. It was almost like it's only National Treasury or the Minister of Finance that is standing in the way.
Well, that might be interesting in the context of part of the evidence that this commission had from Mr. Jonas, namely that during a certain period, there seemed to be a certain level of hostility in Cabinet towards Treasury.
That's true.
Is that something you are able to confirm?
That is very true,
yes.
Chair.
And what you have just told us, namely a different attitude towards Treasury and a different attitude towards the Department of Energy, could it have been part of that hostility?
That is correct.
Yeah. Thank you.
Minister Nene, at paragraph 77, you were explaining to the Chair your response to the attitude of those of your colleagues who felt that you should have progressed the nuclear deal. Would you just deal with the response that you had to your colleagues and their understanding of the implications of what you had been requested to do by the President?
Well, I tried to explain exactly that my refusal was not sign of being arrogant or refusal to do what one is supposed to do, but bound by the legislation, but also with the understanding of what the implications might be. I'm not in a position to do that.
What were your responsibilities as Minister of Finance in such a situation?
As I said earlier, it was responsible for ensuring that the secure, accountable, transparent, sound and effective and efficient management of the country's public finances, sovereign debt and the economy. Right. And in terms of the PFMA, which provides that it's the Minister of Finance, so I would have taken responsibility if I had appended my signature.
Right. Did you address the former President directly in relation to your understanding that you were required to sign that letter?
I did tell the President in the meeting that I could not sign the letter without having first interrogated the financial and fiscal implications and the proposed funding model, which was in line with my statutory mandate, as well as the recent cabinet decision of ensuring sound management, not only of government's finances, but also those of the institutions governed by the Public Finance Management Act.
Did you get the impression in that meeting that the former president understood or accepted that you had these responsibilities?
Look, it was a very tense meeting. It ended with us just being instructed with the minister to go and find a solution, which we didn't find.
But what did he say in response to you telling him, I have statutory obligations, I can't do this until certain things have been done? Assuming he might not have known before you told him that you were acting in the manner in which you were acting because of legal obligations, now you had told him, did his attitude change in any way towards your conduct?
Look, the manner in which the meeting was concluded meant that the two of us, Minister of Energy and myself, just needed to go out and find a solution so that the President is fully appraised of what response to give to his counterpart. I would say the meeting actually ended in an impasse where we just said, you go and find a solution to the matter.
Thank you.
You refer in paragraph 79 to certain discussions that you had with your counterparts in the Russian ministry. Would you tell the Chair about that exchange, please?
Indeed. Whilst still in Ufa, I asked my counterpart, the Russian finance minister, Mr. Silvanov, and his deputy, Mr. Sergei Shatilov, whether they were aware of this nuclear deal and what exactly our countries were talking about. The deputy minister, who speaks English because the minister does not speak good English, you have to speak through the interpreter, is the one who responded that although they had heard of such discussions, they had no real idea what it was about and were not involved in the discussions. This surprised me because if I were to sign anything that had financial commitments from the Russian government, I would have expected my counterparts not only to be aware, but to play a role.
Had you had any warning from the Ministry of Energy or from the Presidency that you would be requested to sign this letter at the BRIC summit in Russia?
No, I had not been forewarned.
And it is clear that, from your evidence at least, that your Russian counterparts were very much in the same position.
Indeed.
The cooperation agreements that you referred to earlier, they were tabled in Parliament, I understand.
Correct.
And you referred to parliamentary questions that were asked as a result. Would you tell the Chair about those?
Well, we were repeatedly asked through parliamentary questions and the media whether the Treasury was consulted on the financing options for the nuclear build program and its fiscal and financial feasibility prior to these agreements being concluded. Generally, I responded to such questions by indicating that nuclear would be a substantial financial commitment and that government was undertaking a careful and thorough analysis of financing options and considering the costs, benefits, and risks of building additional nuclear power stations to ensure the affordability and long-term sustainability of the fiscus and financial soundness of the state-owned entity, which was tasked with undertaking such a program.
You say in the next paragraph that you knew from Mr. Zuma's treatment, as you refer to him, of you in Russia, that he was very unhappy with your refusal to sign the draft letter. Is that perhaps an understatement?
It is correct. It was also confirmed to me in a conversation with the Deputy Minister of Finance, Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, after my return from Russia. I received a call from him about 2 weeks after returning from Russia, and I remember that it was the day of an ANC Lekgotla held towards the end of July 2015. He told me that he had been called to a meeting with Mr. Zuma, in which Mr. Zuma expressed dissatisfaction with me, particularly the stance I took on the nuclear procurement process in UFA, and my refusal to sign the draft letter presented by Ms. Jumat Petersen. This confirmed what I already knew.
What did you do thereafter?
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius. Minister, you might not have picked this up, or you may have picked it up. I just want to make sure you understood. Mr. Pretorius' question that you have just responded to was whether what you say in the first sentence of paragraph 81 is an understatement. You responded by saying this was confirmed, or yes, this was confirmed. I know that you were reading from the second sentence of the paragraph.
Yes.
But I don't know whether you meant to confirm that first sentence is an understatement or not.
Well, understatement in that it's just unhappiness, which could be more than unhappiness. And
okay. No, I just wanted to make sure that you are alert to what the question was saying.
Yes.
So it is an understatement, you say?
It definitely is.
Okay,
well,
thank you.
Perhaps I was being unfair to you, Minister Nene. What was the degree of the former president's dissatisfaction or unhappiness, as you put it?
I think it was more than unhappiness, because as I'm saying that when we say unhappy with my refusal to sign the draft letter, but what was confirmed to me by the conversation that he had was just to show that it was, I don't know, perhaps it's just the degree of unhappiness.
Was it anger?
I think so.
Thank you, Chair. You may ask leading questions without permission in terms of the rules. I cannot. Minister Nene, on your return to South Africa, what did you do with your fellow Treasury officials in relation to the nuclear deal?
Well, I convened the Director General and a team of relevant senior officials at Treasury and instructed them to establish a joint task team with officials, because the last thing you want to do is to upset your boss and not do anything to remedy that. We put together a team and instructed them to establish this joint task team with officials from the Department of Energy. The joint task team was then to be responsible for undertaking the required detailed technical work and preparing a technical report for submission to Cabinet on the financial implications, funding model, and risk and mitigating strategies related to the proposed 9.6 gigawatts nuclear new build program, as had been instructed by Cabinet.
I'm told that it's almost 1 o'clock. The next topic will take more than a few minutes, and may we therefore adjourn.
We'll take the lunch adjournment and we shall resume at 2 o'clock. Adjourn.